A lion lying beside a lamb, a child reaching out to stroke a bear, tables of fruit in a garden that runs to the horizon. For almost a century, this was the image. This was the entire promise. If you grew up inside this faith, or if someone once stood at your door holding a magazine, you saw it. Paradise, green, peaceful, eternal. The lion and the lamb were the brand. So why, in the official videos produced after 2016, has the lion vanished? Why is the imagery now men in tactical gear breaking down doors? Families running into dark forests? Believers crouched in basements with the lights off, listening for footsteps? Emergency bags by the door? Escape routes? The language of siege? Something changed. Not the doctrine on paper, the feeling. The emotional core of an entire religion shifted from a flowered garden to a bunker, from paradise to survival. And here is the question this video is going to answer. Not whether the world is ending. That is the wrong question, and asking it is exactly how they want you to spend your attention. The real question is this: why does an organization that tells 8 million people they are protected by the creator of the universe spend hundreds of millions of dollars on backup generators, broadcast studios, and fortified data redundancy, while telling the ordinary believer to hide in the attic? Because if God protects the faithful, the technology is irrelevant. And if the technology is the priority, then survival was never the point. Something else is being protected inside those walls. Follow the money, and follow the signal. And the answer is sitting in plain sight in upstate New York. Part 1. The garden that disappeared. To see how strange the shift is, you have to remember how total the old image was. For decades, the publications were saturated with one picture above all others: the earthly paradise. It was on the covers. It was the doctrine. It was the entire payoff of the belief system. Endure a little longer. Stay faithful. Inherit a restored earth where suffering simply ends. The lion and the lamb were not decoration. They were the contract. Suffer now, paradise later. And the tone matched the picture. The message was patient. The end was always near. That urgency never left, but the emotional register was hope. You were waiting for something beautiful. Then, in the middle of the last decade, the register flipped. The new visual language is not hope, it is threat. Official productions began portraying a near future in which governments turn on these believers without warning. Doors kicked in, worship driven underground, families scattering into the trees. The believer is no longer walking through a garden. The believer is running, hiding, surviving a hunt. Pay attention to what that change actually does to a person. The paradise did not leave the theology. It left the experience of being a member. And what replaced it was a single, durable emotion: fear. Not fear of God. Fear of the world outside. Hold on to that distinction. Fear of the outside, because everything that follows is built on it. Part 2. The professionalization of fear. This is the part most members never see while they are living inside it, because you cannot read the label from inside the bottle. The fear was not left to chance. It was produced professionally, with scripts, actors, sets, lighting, and a production budget, the same craft a studio brings to a thriller. The persecution scenarios shown to members are not crude warnings. They are cinematic, and cinema works on people in a way a paragraph of doctrine never could. You do not reason your way out of an image of a door being kicked in. You feel it in your body. It bypasses the part of you that asks questions. And every one of these productions delivers the same underlying message, even when it is never said aloud. The world out there is a battlefield, and we are your only safe ground. That is the function. Read it plainly. The fear exists to isolate. A frightened member pulls inward, away from outside friends, away from outside news, away from any source of information the organization does not control. The more dangerous the outside world is made to feel, the tighter the member clings to the only place presented as safe. The organization manufactured a threat and then sold itself as the shelter from that threat. That is not a side effect, that is the design. And notice the timing, because the timing gives the game away. This intensification of fear arrives in the precise decade when leaving became easy. When anyone with a phone can find, in under a minute, every court record, every former member's testimony, every doctrinal reversal the organization has ever made and then denied. The open internet is the single greatest threat this institution has ever faced. Information is the exit. So when the exit is information, what do? You make the believer afraid of the place the information lives. You teach them that the outside world is not merely spiritually risky, It is physically coming for them. You turn curiosity itself into a danger. The first bunker they ever built was never made of concrete. It was built inside the mind, and its only purpose is to keep the member from walking out the door, marked, "The Open Internet." Part 3. The instruction that should stop you cold. There is one piece of official guidance that, once you understand it, you cannot unsee. Members have been told that when the crisis comes, the organization will give directions that may not appear logical from a human standpoint, and the expectation attached to that is simple. Obey anyway. Obey immediately. Do not pause to reason it through. Sit with what that actually installs in a person. It preloads obedience for a future moment that has not arrived yet. It tells you in advance that the instant of maximum chaos is precisely the instant you must switch off your own judgment and follow instructions you don't understand. It rehearses the surrender before the emergency exists. In the context of everything else we are looking at, this is the keystone. Picture the scenario the organization itself keeps painting: social instability, persecution, the world in crisis. In that moment, a population has already been trained to expect commands that make no human sense and to treat hesitation as a spiritual failure. Whatever instruction comes down from the center, however extreme, meets no resistance. The member has been conditioned to believe that salvation itself depends on following the signal that comes from Warwick. That is the prize. Not obedience today, when things are calm. Obedience later, when everything is falling apart and the leadership's word is the only word that still reaches them. Which raises the question of how, exactly, they intend to make sure that word keeps reaching people when the world is coming apart. For that, you have to look at what they built. Warwick is not a headquarters. It's a data center. If you want to find the moment the garden became a bunker, you go to Warwick, New York. In 2017, the organization finished its New World headquarters there and walked away from the iconic Brooklyn properties it had held for over a century. The official story is gentle. A quieter, more efficient campus in the countryside. Now look at what was actually built. Warwick is not an office park. It is a self-sufficient complex engineered for continuity through collapse. It generates its own power, it manages its own water, and at its heart sit state-of-the-art media production studios, broadcast and 4K video facilities capable of producing content for the entire global membership and pushing it out without depending on anyone else's infrastructure. Redundant power. Protected communications. Server capacity built to keep running when the outside grid does not. Now ask the question the official story hopes you won't. If Armageddon is a divine act, if God himself steps in to protect his people, then what are the generators for? What is the server redundancy for? You do not need backup power to be saved by a miracle. A miracle does not require fiber optics. If the rescue is supernatural, every dollar spent on broadcast continuity is a dollar wasted. Unless the rescue was never the plan, unless the real objective is far more practical, to keep the audience connected to the leadership through any social instability that comes. The technology only makes sense if the goal is not to survive the end of the world, but to keep broadcasting through it. Warwick is not a fortress for people, it is a fortress for a signal. And a religion does not need a signal. A media company does. The flow of the money. Now follow the capital, because the money moves in a direction the sermons never mention. Look first at what the ordinary member is told to do. Simplify your life, reduce your possessions, be ready to leave at a moment's notice. Pack a go bag, the small emergency kit by the door. Many have been encouraged to sell property, to free themselves of attachments, to live light and ready to flee. The whole posture aimed at the base is downsizing. Own less. Be prepared to lose what little remains. Now look at what is being built at the top. State-of-the-art film studios, fortified data infrastructure, redundant power systems, a media campus engineered to outlast a crisis. The posture aimed at the center is the exact opposite of the base. Not downsizing, but the most expensive construction in the organization's history. And here is the part that should land hardest, because it connects the two. Over the past decade, the organization has sold kingdom halls, not a handful, thousands of them, across many countries. These are the local meeting halls that ordinary congregations built with their own hands and paid for with their own donations across generations. In region after region, ownership had been quietly consolidated under the central organization. And then they were sold off. Congregations that built a hall were told to merge, to travel further, to surrender the building their parents had financed. Where did the proceeds go? Up, toward the center, toward the studios and the fortified core. Watch the direction of the flow and the whole picture snaps into place. Wealth is moving out of the base, out of the hands of the ordinary believer, out of the local community, out of the assets the flock actually built, and up into a concentrated, fortified technology center controlled entirely by the leadership. The believers were told to sell, simplify, and prepare to flee. The proceeds of all that selling became the elite's bunker. State it plainly, because it is brutal in its simplicity. The members are funding the construction of the very walls that will never protect them. They are being asked to downsize so that the center can be fortified. And that forces the question I promised at the start. When the persecution everyone is being trained to fear finally comes, who actually ends up safe inside? Part 6. Who gets a place inside? Let's be precise about what the average member is actually instructed to do when the crisis arrives. They are not given a place in Warwick. There are no keys handed out to a fortified complex. The guidance for the ordinary believer, the publisher, in their language, is far humbler. Find a basement, an attic, a back room. Wait it out where you are, in an ordinary home in an ordinary city, with the go bag by the door. Now hold the two images side by side. The leadership, operating from a complex with its own power, its own water, protected communications, engineered to keep functioning no matter what happens outside. The member, 60 years old, in an apartment, told to crouch in the dark and hope. If the persecution is truly global, if it falls equally on everyone who shares this faith, then why is the protection so unequal? Why is the survival infrastructure concentrated almost entirely at the top, while the people who paid for it are told to improvise with whatever they can find at home? You cannot preach a shared catastrophe and then build a private shelter for the few. Unless the catastrophe, for the people at the top, was never the real concern. What they are protecting is not the flock. It is the ability to keep speaking to the flock. Step back far enough and you see what this organization has actually become. And it is not what it was. For most of the 20th century, it presented itself as a Bible society. Printing presses, magazines, literature carried door to door. The identity was publishing and preaching, paper and ink. That organization is gone. What exists now is, in function, a technology and media company. The printing has been cut dramatically. The capital and the energy have shifted to digital broadcast, streaming, proprietary apps, and a closed media ecosystem that delivers content directly and exclusively to members. The organization produces its own video, on its own platforms, distributed through its own fortified studios, consumed inside its own walled garden of information, and that reframes every piece we have examined. Why fortify the headquarters? To protect the broadcast. Why pour the wealth into the center? To build and defend the platform. Why keep members inside a closed ecosystem, dependent on the organization's own streams and apps, rather than the open internet? Because controlling the information a person receives is controlling the person. The fortress, the studios, the redundant power, they all serve one function: to guarantee that no matter what happens in the world, the leadership's voice remains the only voice the member can still hear. Now every thread ties together. The manufactured fear isolates the member from outside information. The instruction to obey the illogical preloads their compliance for the crisis. The liquidation of local property funds the fortified core, and the core itself is built not to shelter bodies, but to keep one signal alive. The bunker is not a shelter from the end of the world. It is the server room of an information empire. And the whole point of an information empire is to be the last voice standing when everything else goes quiet. So return to where we began. The lion and the lamb. The garden. The promise. It didn't fade because the leadership stopped believing in paradise. It faded because fear is simply more useful than hope. A hopeful believer waits patiently and sooner or later starts asking questions. A frightened believer obeys, donates, isolates, and never finds the stillness to wonder where the money went or who ends up safe. Every piece fits one pattern. The shift from garden to bunker keeps members afraid of the outside world at the precise moment that outside world, the open flow of information, became the greatest threat to the institution's control. The theology of imminent persecution preloads obedience for a future crisis. The liquidation of kingdom halls moves wealth from the base to the fortified top. And the transformation into a closed media empire ensures that when instability comes, the leadership's voice is the only one that survives. The generators, the studios, the server redundancy, none of it makes sense for a people waiting on a miracle. All of it makes sense for an institution determined to remain the single source of truth its members are permitted to hear. The end of the world may or may not be near, but the building of this organization's technology and media empire has never been further along or more secure. So here is the question to sit with. Are they preparing to survive the end of the system? Or are they preparing to be the owners of the only system their members will still be allowed to see? If this gave you something to think about, stay a moment before you go. Subscribe and tell me in the comments. If the persecution is meant for everyone, who do you really think gets a place inside the walls? I read every reply, and there is far more to this story than a single video can hold. So stay close. We are only beginning to follow where this leads.